Erik Larson has just published a new book called Demon of Unrest. It's about the first 5 months of Abraham Lincoln's term as president. In other words, it's the short period leading up to the start of the Civil War. I haven't been able to get it from the library yet. I'm on the waiting list. Can't wait to get it. Now, here's a dirty little secret. I do really like getting books for free, so I use the library a lot. But anyway, now Erik Larson was in my mind, and I like his books. I think I've read them all. So I decided I'd reread one of them. I picked this one, Dead Wake. It's the story of the sinking of the Lusitania. But before I get into it, let me drop a little footnote here about the title. The phrase, dead wake, refers to the trail of bubbles a torpedo leaves on the surface when it's on its way to its target. So that's dead wake, that's the title. Now everybody knows the broad outline of the story of the sinking of the Lusitania. What happened was that on May 7th, 1915, a German submarine, U-20, sank it with a single torpedo. The torpedo blew a hole the size of a house below the ship's waterline, and the ship, the Lusitania, went down in minutes. Now, the Lusitania had been the fastest and the most luxurious ship afloat. It was traveling from New York to Liverpool. It was carrying 1,959 men, women, and children on board. The sinking caused the death of almost 1,200 of them, including 123 Americans. What this book does is to go deep into the details behind the bare bones of that story. But it's not some esoteric, dry as dust history book. Erik Larson goes well beyond the mere chronological narrative of the sinking. He gives detailed pictures of the ship, the crew, and the passengers on board, and he does the same thing for the sub, U-20. And he also gets into the main players in the governments that were actually involved, that were overlooking this whole thing. When I say that this book is not some kind of dry as dust textbook, I mean that the book is very much structured and written pretty much like a novel. Erik Larson keeps to a kind of chronological format, but he is constantly shifting the scene from New York to London to Liverpool to Germany, and of course from the ship to the sub. This back and forth creates a very, very fast-paced narrative of the sinking. There were three things that really stood out to me about this book. The first was the role that chance, simply chance, played in the whole story. There were a lot of factors that came together that permitted U-20 to successfully sink this ocean liner. If any of these circumstances had changed just a little bit, the whole thing would have never happened. For example, if the Lusitania were just a little earlier or a little later off the coast of Ireland, if the weather was a little different, or if it had taken a slightly different course, it would have never met U-20. In the same way, if the British had acted on intelligence that they had about U-20, which, by the way, was dead accurate, they could have changed things like the Lusitania's course. And they could have prevented the Lusitania from sailing past Ireland with absolutely no escort. Now, similarly, from the German side, the same kind of things could have taken U-20 out of the picture. Take, for example, there was a 60% failure rate on German torpedoes. The sub-commander just happened to get one of the 40% that worked. Okay, chance. Unfortunately, none of the what-ifs actually happened, and we've got a tragedy. Now, the second thing I found very interesting was a thing called Room 40. And that was the British Admiralty's code-breaking department. It was the World War I equivalent of Bletchley Park, and it worked really well. It provided dead accurate information about U-20's location, its course, its mission. Now, the British never acted on any of this intelligence for reasons that even after reading this book, I still don't understand. Now, it's certain that at least a substantial part of the British government wanted the U.S. to get involved in World War I, and they certainly understood that Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare might very well do the trick. But there's no evidence at all that this sinking was a direct result of that desire. In fact, presumably the Brits required the kind of stuff that was being shipped from the U.S. In all events, even though people maybe some Brits may have hoped that the American deaths on the Lusitania might have triggered the U.S. to enter the war, it didn't happen. The Lusitania went down in 1915, but the U.S. didn't enter the war until 2 years later. Okay, so chance, Room 40. The third thing that stood out for me about Larson's treatment of the sinking was his description of the technology involved in submarines and torpedoes. I found all of that super interesting. He not only gets into the technology involved in subs and torpedoes, but he paints a picture of what life was like for the crews and the commanders of these submarines. As you can tell, I thought the book on the whole was a really compelling, page-turning read. I do have one nitpick with the book. And that is why Erik Larson spent so much time narrating Woodrow Wilson's romancing of Edith Galt. That whole thing had absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the sinking. And it didn't contribute to explaining why the U.S. waited until 1917 to join World War I. To me, it was just a total waste of ink. But I gotta say, Erik Larson has a way with words, and I have to admit that I read it with a lot of interest. Well, to me, Dead Wake is a great piece of popular history, and if Larson's new book is anywhere near as good, I'm going to be absolutely delighted to read it. That's all I got for now. See you next week.